Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Andras asked me to chair this session because John Gardner wasn't able to attend the conference. He wrote a couple of weeks ago explaining that he's now gravely ill and unable to travel. So this, of course, is a matter of huge and painful regret. Still, it's a great privilege for me to introduce my colleague from UCL, Ulrike Heuer, who's going to talk under the title Williams on Moral Luck and Justification. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Paul and Anna, Marta, Jacob, Andras, all the people who have been put together this marvelous conference. It's really been a treat. So this paper will focus on the first part of Williams's famous moral luck paper, the part that is very often ignored, right? For many people, the story starts when it comes to agent regret and the lorry driver and so on. But the earlier part is kind of irritating, and it's a bit hard to see what he's doing there, really. And I will tell a story about that. I don't know whether this actually is Williams's story or whether he will find that this is a complete distortion, but here it goes. So in his paper Moral Luck, Bernard Williams makes the striking claim that a person's action can be justified by success, even when success is a matter of luck. But it has to be the right kind of luck, luck where the conditions are intrinsic or internal to what the person is doing. I want to begin with a few preliminaries just about the terms. So Williams, starting with luck, Williams was, to my knowledge, the first who introduced the term moral luck and couldn't foresee the way in which it would catch on. He expresses some misgivings about the term, probably because its ordinary implications don't quite capture what he's after. But just to distinguish what I believe are two senses of speaking about luck, so calling something lucky sometimes means that it was unforeseen or perhaps unforeseeable, perhaps against the odds, and luck usually has a valence. It's either good luck or bad luck. So Williams means some of this too, of course. He speaks of luck when the outcome of an action was unforeseeable, for instance. But there is a second sense of luck. We might say that a person got lucky not because the outcome was unforeseeable, but because she did, because what she did led to a favorable outcome, despite the fact that she lacked the capacity, skills, or know-how for achieving it. For instance, when a petty thief goes undetected, we might say that the thief got lucky. But there we don't mean that it was unforeseeable that she would get away, but rather that it was not thanks to her mastery of escape that she got away. Or perhaps someone wins a game. If this is merely lucky, it is not because of the player's superior abilities. I think that's what's meant by this. Thus, when a welcome outcome is realized, but it did not depend on the exercise of an agent's abilities or skills, we call it lucky. This second sense of luck will be relevant, I think, to Williams' discussion as well. It will help to explain the difference between internal and external conditions of success and failure. My second point on justification and responsibility. So, second thing to note is that the moral luck discussion after Williams has been about responsibility, but Williams opens with justification. He ends with responsibility, and the two are, of course, connected. If a person is justified in what she did, then if what she did appeared to be wrong, the justification sometimes shows that it wasn't wrong after all. She's responsible then for what she did, but since it turns out not to have been wrong, she's also not to blame. However, Williams' claim in Moral Luck is that this needn't be so. One can have a justification even when this doesn't show that what one did was not wrong. This is certainly interesting, but somewhat removed from the question of responsibility itself. It's about what one is. It's about how bad it is, the thing one is responsible for, or how to apportion blame, perhaps. Third thing, the notion of responsibility itself. I will presuppose that being blameworthy and being responsible are not the same thing. Some philosophers disagree about this. For instance, according to J. Wallace, who develops a version of Strawson's view, a person is responsible for what she does if we can hold her responsible. And we can hold her responsible if certain reactive attitudes, such as blame, for instance, are appropriate, or if it's fair to exhibit them. He calls responsibility a practical concept because of a dependence of being responsible on holding responsible. Now, this seems wrong to me. Even if it were true that a person is responsible only if it is appropriate to hold her responsible, that would not establish any priority of the practical. That is, of holding responsible. After all, if I hold a person responsible, I take her to be responsible. It would be morally objectionable if I held someone responsible without believing that she actually is responsible. Thus, my holding a person responsible conceptually depends on her being responsible. There also is no epistemic priority here. It is not true that to judge a person responsible, I must hold her responsible or have reactive attitudes towards her. I can judge that someone is responsible without having any reactive attitudes. I think this seems at least obvious to me. Maybe not to you. I don't know. So, of course, a person can be blameworthy for something she is not responsible. She cannot be blameworthy for something she's not responsible for. But whether a person is responsible does not depend on the appropriateness of reactive attitudes, but the other way around. Being responsible is one of the conditions for the appropriateness of reactive attitudes. One test is whether there can be actions for which a person is responsible that do not warrant reactive attitudes. And I hope that Williams is basically on my side here. He's not, as far as I know, explicitly discussing this, but he seems to give a nod to the idea that there can be actions for which one is responsible, but that don't warrant attitudes. I have a quote on the handout from Shame and Necessity where he says, the significance of someone's life and its relations to society may be such that someone needs to recognize and express his responsibility for actions when no one else would have a right to make a claim of damages or be in a position to do so. So admittedly, this is not about reactive attitudes, but claims for damages. But I hope it provides some support that Williams is not hostile to the understanding of responsibility that I assume here. Williams' discussion of the lorry driver is a further source of support. The driver assumes responsibility, and rightly so, Williams seems to suggest, even if no one is in a position to blame him or hold him responsible in any other way. So, if so, the claim I granted for the sake of argument above, that a person can be responsible only if it is appropriate to hold her responsible, is actually false. So with these preliminaries in place, I want to get to the question of responsibility and Williams' claim about the relevance of intrinsic and intrinsic, extrinsic luck, internal, external conditions. I'm a bit uneasy about the terminology because what Williams actually uses is intrinsic and external. So this is a bit exasperating, but I kind of take it that perhaps he doesn't want to commit to the philosophical implications, but just gesture at something where we still have to find out what exactly it is. That's at least the spirit in which I take it. But first, I will try to get justification out of the way. So this is my next section. After that, I want to develop a view of responsibility for outcomes and the relevance of what Williams calls internal and external conditions. So justification. Williams explains that if Gauguin's project succeeds, then he has some justification for his action of leaving his family and taking off to realize his talent, albeit not a justification that the family he left in the lurch would have to accept. As I remarked above, providing a justification in the context of responsibility is often seen as showing that what the person did was not wrong. The way in which Gauguin's project is likely to be judged blameworthy or wrong is with regard to leaving his family in dire misery. Imagine that as really dire, as does Williams. I don't know what the real case was, actually, but think it was really bad. So Williams claims that the relevant justification isn't affecting his family's complaint. If his justification doesn't speak to that, what then does it do? So perhaps it just means that he had a reason for his decision. After all, he already has proven himself a somewhat talented artist, and developing his potential is his most ardent dream, or so I assume that could be his reason. But isn't that a defeated reason? Gauguin has obligations towards his family which might rightly be seen as defeaters of whatever reason he has to develop his artistic talent, at least when doing so requires abandoning the family. A parent who is under an obligation to bring up his children may, of course, also further personal projects, but not in a way that leads to the children's destitution. Gauguin could, for instance, have abandoned his job as a stockbroker, he really was a stockbroker, to become an arts teacher, even if his children then would not have been able to attend the best private schools, say. Integrating his personal project and his parental duties in this way seems perfectly acceptable. That is, a parent's obligations to his children do not require him to give up all personal ambitions if he can offer them a decent start in life without doing so. But abandoning the children altogether, leaving them with no education at all, or even to starve or something dreadful like that, seems indefensible. So this is an understanding of obligation which is slightly different from what Steve developed last night. So it's more along the lines that obligations are exclusionary reasons, actually. So thus, whether Gauguin is justified in what he does depends on the details of the case, in particular on the consequences for his children. But whether he succeeds in becoming an artist is not among the relevant details here. If he is right, if this is right, then finding a justification which somehow bears on the loss to his family seems hopeless, and I think it is. So well, or is it? So even if he has only a defeated reason for doing what he does, might that not still provide a sort of partial justification? A weak-willed agent can offer a defeated reason for her action, in part to explain, but in part also to justify what she did. That there was something to be said for it. So if this were the remaining sense of justification for Gauguin's departure, even if his reason for leaving is defeated, might that do? No, because the defeated reason even if the defeated reason provides some kind of justification, it's independent of success again. Williams claims that success itself justifies. So how might it do that? So here's another attempt. Perhaps like this. If Gauguin's reason to leave is that doing so will enable him to become a great artist, then if he does not become a great artist, there is no reason. Compare, for instance, I buy a ticket for a train to get to a meeting, but unbeknownst to me, the meeting has been cancelled. But I had a reason for buying the ticket, didn't I? In one sense, yes. In another, you may want to say that I only had an apparent reason. After all, my instrumental reason to buy the ticket derives from my reason to attend the meeting. But I cannot have a reason to attend a meeting which doesn't take place. So one might say that there is no reason for me to buy the ticket, even though I'm not aware of that. But if the meeting does take place, there is such a reason. Whether or not there is a reason for me to buy a ticket depends on something that will happen in the future, the meeting actually taking place. Gauguin's case is a bit like this. After all, he leaves his family only as a means to realizing his artistic talent, or the talent he hopes to have. Whether there is an instrumental reason for the action depends on whether he actually has and realizes his artistic talent. However, if this were the sense of justification Williams had in mind, why would he introduce the distinction of internal and external conditions of success and failure? If the fact that the meeting doesn't take place makes it true that I have no justification for buying the ticket, if the cancellation unjustifies my ticket buying action, to use Williams' expression, it doesn't matter why the meeting is cancelled or in which way this happened. So this too can't be it. Now, there was a further failed attempt that I had on regarding leaving the family and becoming an artist, or looking after the family and becoming an artist as incommensurate. But I think this is already out of the way with the first thing I said, with obligation towards the children. The two options are not incommensurate, at least it seems to me they are not. There is one more on different reading. So a number of people think Williams' argument is this: if a person makes an unjustified or bad decision, she has reason to regret it. And then he argues by modus tollens, Gauguin in hindsight doesn't have reason to regret his decision, therefore his decision cannot have been unjustified. Now, J. Wallace shows at length that this argument is not successful because the conditional premise is false. Wallace argues that not having reason to regret an earlier decision does not show that the decision is justified, looking at a range of counterexamples. There is another attempt with the same argument actually to defend it by Merdan Cohen, which is interesting, but I think ultimately also not successful. I'm not going to talk through it now, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to do it in discussion. So with this unsatisfying run through some option, I'm going to leave Williams' claim about justification behind. From now on, I will look at responsibility. And let me just give you, I think this is maybe not as much against the grain as it seems. So I put a couple of quotes on the handout, which are from the postscript to Moral Luck that Williams has written, where he writes, "The question of retrospective justification is the question of how far and in what ways the view that an agent retrospectively takes of himself or herself may be affected by results not directed simply to the ways in which he or she deliberated, but might have been deliberated before, or might have better deliberated, before the event. My involvement in my action and its results go beyond the relation I have to it as an ex ante rational deliberator." So if the topic is my involvement in my action and its result, it's much more naturally understood as being about responsibility than about justification. Okay, so then going to internal and external condition. So if Gauguin's success is merely lucky, would he be responsible for it? would it be appropriate to praise him for his artwork and admire it? Williams distinguishes between internal and external conditions of success and failure here. I believe that something like his distinction is crucial for explaining responsibility for the consequences of one's action. So I want to explore the following hypothesis about the role of this distinction. Gauguin is responsible for his success even because it is due to internal conditions. Had he failed, he would have been responsible for the failure if the failure had been due to internal conditions, but not responsible if it were due to external conditions. So there are lots of blanks here, especially this internal-external stuff, but I hope things belong together in this way. So Williams explains the distinction of internal-external conditions in Moral Luck. There is a long quote, and even though it's long, I think I read it. You may all be aware of it, but nonetheless. So he writes, it matters considerably to the thoughts we are considering in what way the project fails to come off if it fails. If Gauguin sustains some injury on the way to Tahiti, which prevents his ever painting again, that certainly means that his decision was for nothing. And indeed, there is nothing in the outcome to set against other people's loss. But that train of events does not provoke the thought in question that, after all, he was wrong and unjustified. He does not and never will know whether he was wrong. What would prove him wrong in his project would not just be that it failed, but that he failed. The distinction shows, so this is continuing quote, that while Gauguin's justification is in some ways a matter of luck, it is not equally a matter of all kinds of luck. It matters how intrinsic to the cause of failure, how intrinsic the cause of failure is to the project itself. Sorry. The occurrence of an injury is luck of the most external and incident kind. Irreducibly, luck of this kind affects whether he will be justified or not, since if it strikes, he will not be justified. But it is too external for it to unjustify him, something which only his failure as a painter can do. Yet still, that is at another level luck, the luck of being able to be as he hoped he might be. It might be wondered whether that is luck at all. It is not merely luck that he is such a man, but luck relative to the deliberations that went into his decision, and he turns out to be such a man he might epistemically not have been. So this is, of course, again about justification, and even in the sense of having something to set against other people's loss. But Williams himself observes that this is not really the issue, since Gauguin has nothing to point to if he fails, whether he fails due to internal or external conditions. Furthermore, as I argued above, there simply is no justification, at least I can't find one, to be set against the loss, at least not on a common understanding of parental duties. But Williams is pointing to something important nonetheless. If Gauguin fails as a matter of mere bad luck due to external conditions, he will not be responsible for that failure. But if he fails because he is not the man he thought he is, that is at least a starting point for the view that he then might be responsible. So can we then also say the reverse? If he succeeds as a matter of mere dumb luck, that is luck due to external conditions, he then is not responsible for the success. But if he succeeds because he turns out to be the artist he hoped to be, then he is. Well, we would if we could, but it's not possible to succeed as a matter of mere dumb luck in something like the project Gauguin undertakes. As Williams notes himself, it is not merely luck that he is such a man, but why not? It is, after all, in principle possible to succeed by luck. If I buy a lottery ticket hoping that it will win, there's no other way to succeed. So if Gauguin were to say I was lucky, this might mean that he succeeded because of an unforeseen event, which is the kind of luck that Williams envisioned in the external failure case. But the only way to succeed in becoming an artist is by developing one's talents and capacities in quite a directed way. This may, of course, there may, of course, be luck involved in such success. So perhaps Van Gogh was lucky to have a brother who supported him and provided him with the means of pursuing his passion. But an indispensable part of the success lies with who the person is, whether he has the talent, the sensitivity, the stamina, and the ambition of an artist, or is able to develop them. Yeah, I want to actually compare the Gauguin case to a case of failure in what comes. Williams himself provides one. It's the case of Anna Karenina. Now, I don't want to use that one because it brings in further complexities that I will not try to talk about, because the point of this is that Anna's failure is internal, even though the failure depends on things nothing to do with her agency. So it depends in part on the lack of social acceptance of her behavior and the way in which being socially ostracized erodes a relationship. And that's interesting and great topic, but not my topic today. So I'm using a different example, and thought, perhaps in keeping with what William's doing here, I will use the example of Isabel Archer, the Henry James heroine in Portrait of a Lady. Now, if you love a novel, then there's often a presumptuous tendency to think everybody else does too and has read it and remembers the details. Now, in a way, this is what I'm doing in the written text, but does anybody want me to try to give a very brief summary of the plot? Yeah, okay. So the story goes like this. Isabel Archer, after her parents die, goes to England to live with, she's an American, living with part of her family in England in a country house estate. Mainly her uncle and his son, and his son is suffering, I believe, from something like tuberculosis. He was destined for death from the beginning. So he hasn't all that long to go. And she is an enormous success in this country house setting in England because she's such a wave of fresh air, right? So she brings a lot of independent spirit and unconventional views, a kind of freedom-loving outlook. She wants to explore things, and everybody thinks yes, and then since she is such an attractive woman, she will soon be proposed to, and goes the way all women go into marriage. And she is being proposed to, very good proposals actually, and turns it down. Now that makes the cousin, the to-die cousin, perk up. He really takes an interest and thinks, oh, this is a very interesting young woman who turns these offers down. And he has this idea that, as it were, he wants to see her soar, fly, really, as an independent spirit, and negotiates with his father, who dies soon after that. He leaves a good part of his legacy to Isabel Archer. Okay, and then they go, as perhaps one did, to Italy, to Florence in the summer, and there she is being driven towards an American who has been living there as a very highbrow art collector, Gilbert Osman. There is a matchmaking in there, which I will not explain here, sort of pushing her in his way. And he's an unusual character, something she'd never come across, right? Somebody of very exquisite taste, a collector of artwork, but he doesn't have any means, so it's very selective and all very fine. And he has a daughter who's almost grown. And he then eventually proposes to her, but in a much less straightforward, much more sophisticated, sort of eerie way than the earlier candidates do, and she is taken in. And so she actually, against everybody's advice, marries Osmond. So she is deliberating, they are thinking about it, there is a lot of advice coming around, for instance, from the cousin, from other people who say, don't. You're mistaken about this guy, and she does. And then we encounter her again some years later when the friends from England come visit in Rome, where she has changed completely. She's become a very guarded and non-trusting, sort of cautious woman, and it turns out by and by that this has really been a horrible marriage, that he is an awfully manipulative character. She thought he was so independently minded in never pursuing any profession or anything in his life and just exquisitely collecting art. But in fact, we find out more and more that she had money was a big reason that he married her, and the main thing he wants is to be seen as a respectable or even superior person within the society in Rome. So that's that period. And then there is one further step where she is called back to England because her cousin is about to die, and against Osmond, who is really sort of manipulative. He's a horrible villain, actually. He's manipulative and threatening, sort of not physically threatening, but psychologically. And he tries to prevent her by all means from going to England, but she goes. And I think that's when she goes, the story takes off. It ends soon after. It ends actually, so she's offered ways to flee basically out of the marriage. She doesn't. She returns to Rome. We don't know what happens there. But it's clear that from having been subdued and brought down, there may be sort of a way forward. So that's basically the story, at least as I see it. So in Portrait of a Lady, Henry James' heroine, Isabel Archer, when she encounters Gilbert Osmond, is taken in by certain features of his character that she believes to show an independence of mind and of the judgments of others, and she admires him for those traits. She's completely mistaken about this, as their subsequent marriage cruelly reveals. Isabel Archer nonetheless accepts responsibility for her unhappy marriage. She wasn't forced, quite to the contrary. She defied advice from trusted friends who urged her not to proceed with her project of marrying Osmond. As she sees it, those friends are either interested parties, that would be the cousin, and therefore whose judgment is therefore distorted, or people who are in the grip of the wrong kinds of values, and who are therefore unable to appreciate the worthy character of her beloved, who doesn't care for the values that other people cherish. As always with examples from literature or life, the story is complex. It turns out that she was partly cunningly deceived by Osmond, and is not just misled because of her own lack of experience. But let me focus narrowly on just one aspect here: her reliance on her judgment of Osmond's character. She had some evidence for it. The interpretation of the evidence may have been flawed, but at the time, she could not have been expected to do better. Thus, her bad judgment and the subsequent unhappy marriage appear to be non-derivative failures. I come back to derivative. There isn't anything she could or should have known which foreseeably led to the bad outcome. Is she then responsible for making the decision that seals her unhappy fate? Well, she herself seems to think so, that she accepts responsibility for the bad decision and its consequences is obvious when her friends come to visit her in Rome, and perhaps also towards the end of the novel when, after having seen her cousin for the last time in England before he dies, she decides to return to Rome and thereby to her marriage. Osmond's actual deceit might militate against that, but the fact that he relies very expressly on her own bad judgment supports it. And this seems to be so whether or not we think she should have responded differently to her friend's advice or to evidence available at the time. Of course, James, the narrator, makes it amply clear to his reader that she is taken in, right? We know that all the time. So if we think that Isabel Archer lacks some epistemic virtues, her case may be in that regard different from Gorgons, who's portrayed by Williams as assessing his own situation correctly. But it doesn't seem that those epistemic flaws make a difference. She doesn't take responsibility because she later finds her earlier judgments badly supported. That she takes responsibility is not because she finds she has flouted what Gideon Rosen calls procedural epistemic obligations, but because it was she, a person of a certain character, who very recognizably shaped her own fate, and she has since become the person who has been shaped in this way. Her marked change of character is the result of taking the route she decided on. Her case illustrates a bit, I think, what Williams describes in Shame and Necessity as one's life could not be partitioned into some things that one does intentionally and other things that merely happen to one, explaining with Oedipus in his mind, what matters is how much was changed by what he did, that he was triumphantly king of Thebes, for instance, and now is not. So I think this is quite nicely in parallel. Isabel Archer also was triumphant at some point and then not. So similarly, Isabel Archer was a freedom-loving, independent, curious young woman, but all of that changed when she entered into the marriage. She became guarded, non-trusting, and an unhappy person. The failure here is internal to the project because it is a result in the conscientious exercise of her ability to make a good decision. At the time, no further evidence would have changed it. That's probably not literally true, but it wouldn't have been easy. And we admire her for being this kind of a young person, despite the fact that it seals her fate. If she were to declare I was unlucky, it would be hard to understand what that could even mean. When a person leads her life exercising her abilities without a glitch, actually, some of those abilities having to do with deliberation and reasoning, the result is not a matter of luck. When the consequences of the decision are different from what the person has hoped for, it is a failure, but this kind of failure cannot be ultimately guarded against. The point Williams focuses on is that the best deliberation is not enough to secure success. Isabel Archer would have to have been a different person to have a happy marriage with Osmond, a man who values social appreciation, honor, as he puts it, above all else. And she also would have to have been a different person to figure out ahead of time what it is like to be married to Osmond. The way in which she is mistaken about Osmond is somehow to her credit and in part what makes her admirable. In this way, her position is parallel to Gauguin's, who cannot know whether he will be able to develop the relevant abilities. He would have to have been a different person to have been able to know this ahead of time, he would have had to be an artist already. So if his is internal success, then hers is internal failure internal to the project, I think. But why not think in both cases that they are not responsible for the consequences of their decisions, because, as just explained, there is a sense in which they decided in ignorance. Ignorance is an excuse when blameworthiness lurks in the wings. In Isabel Archer's case, there is no need for an excuse. Gauguin, by contrast, is blameworthy and could do with an excuse. So perhaps he could launch an ignorance excuse. But no. What he is ignorant of is whether he will succeed, telling his family that they mustn't blame him because when he made his decision he didn't know whether or not he will succeed, wouldn't make any sense at all. So if you allow for my earlier rejection of justification by success, he really doesn't have a leg to stand on here. But there's a different way in which ignorance could matter. It is sometimes said that when a person acts in ignorance, her responsibility for the result can at best be derivative. It is derivative if the result of an action foreseeably derives from something the agent did for which she was non-derivatively responsible, which must mean at the very least that there was no ignorance. I will say a bit more about this in the next section, but just to sum up where I take myself to have gotten to. So a failure and a success is internal to the project if it results from the agent's exercise of her abilities. More precisely, a failure is internal if it results from the agent's failure in exercising her abilities. And a success is internal if it results from an agent's success in exercising her abilities. The formulations are meant to exclude two cases. The one is unlucky failure. An exercise of one's ability can fail for reasons external to the project, as Williams notes. This would happen, for instance, if Gauguin incurred an injury. It could happen in other ways as well. And the second case it's guarding against is lucky success. So the exercise of one's abilities can sometimes lead to success in a way that has little to do with one's abilities. So my two examples are both not suited to exemplify such cases. But imagine a case of an accomplished archer who shoots his arrow but badly. That is, he exercises his abilities badly, but through a gust of wind the arrow's course is bent and he ends up shooting a bullseye. So that would be an example of lucky success by somebody who actually exercises their abilities, but I think they cannot claim responsibility for the success. Okay, now derivative responsibility. This way of accounting for responsibility for failure comes up against a more common view already mentioned above, the view that so my view, the one I laid out, comes up against the view that such failure is derivative. So responsibility for the non-intended outcomes of one's action is often seen as derivative. A person is derivatively responsible for fying if she's non-derivatively responsible for doing something else, psying, which foreseeably leads to her fying. Acting in ignorance might then be a special case in which the non-intended result is due to ignorance, rather than to other kinds of failure. The action for which there is derivative responsibility must somehow follow on from the one for which there is non-derivative responsibility, as in cases where by doing A, I do B. For instance, take a doctor who by performing surgery on a patient kills him, or another way would be where by doing A, I bring about B. So take a doctor who by performing surgery triggers a condition that leads to a fatal result. But ignorance isn't always an excuse. When a person is responsible for the ignorance itself, then she is also responsible for the consequences of acting in ignorance. Why and when is she responsible for her ignorance then? Rosen proposes that she's responsible if she violates, as I said already, her procedural epistemic obligations. So what exactly are those? What do they require? Sometimes this is cashed out roughly as taking the precautions that a reasonable person would have taken in that situation. But this still appears quite vague, and it also looks to me like a test that you would apply in law rather than in life. So to get a bit clearer here, I will adapt an argument from Joseph Raz, who also discusses this idea of derivative responsibility in his piece on responsibility for negligence. So Raz writes, that's on the handout, negligence involves derivative responsibility. People are responsible for negligent harming because they are responsible for breach of a duty of care. But we know my liability depends not only on wrongful action, but on wrongful action for which I'm responsible. This is where derivative principle comes in. It has the form, if one is responsible for action A, and if by doing A one does B, which is the bringing about of some consequence, then one is responsible for B, provided the action meets a certain condition. The condition is that avoiding that consequence was the rationale of the duty to perform A. So which obligations the doctor, for instance, has will depend on the rationale for the duty to overcome the ignorance. She's not under a duty to know everything that there is to be known, but presumably under a duty to know about and check on likely conditions that lead to complications. Therefore, if the rationale for the duty to overcome ignorance does not require the kind of research that would have been needed to overcome it in a particular case, the ignorance would presumably serve as an excuse. So how about ignorance in Isabel Archer's and Gorgons' cases? If we apply Raz's condition to Isabel Archer's case and ask whether she is responsible for her ignorance of Osman's true character, the answer could be yes, if she was, or would be yes, if she was under an obligation to find out about it and did not, and furthermore, if the rationale why she was under such an obligation is that complying with it would have avoided the bad consequences. The case is moot, I think. I was oscillating on this before. Is the fact that she misinterprets the evidence something that shows her to be epistemically less than virtuous? Is the rationale for urging people not to enter into marriages without having taken the measure of the intended not properly taken into account by Isabel Archer's inquiring mind? On the other hand, she does engage in much reflection on the evidence available to her. Her reasoning does take the friend's warning into account. Her rejection of their objections doesn't seem to be epistemically unsound. There wasn't anything that, from her vantage point, would have allowed her to come to the conclusion that marrying Osmond will be a grave mistake. As remarked already, we admire her in part for the trusting, idealizing way in which she approaches the men in her life. It is part and parcel of being a young woman of her type, one who has an independent, inquiring mind, but is not very experienced. On the other hand, her judgment is false, and James provides quite a number of clues for his reader to make them aware of that. Is she then responsible for the failure, for her bad judgment? If not, she would also not be derivatively responsible for its severe consequences, according to the derivative responsibility view. And how about Gorgons? As it stands, the ignorance excuse can apply only to failure cases, after all. It is an excuse, and success isn't looking for an excuse. Thus, if the relation of our agents to the outcome and to their... How long do I have? if the relation of our agents to the outcome of their actions is very similar and therefore accounting for responsibility should follow similar lines, then there is a lack of generality here. Becoming a great painter was not unintended in Gauguin's case, to the degree it's possible to intend such a thing. So while he acted not knowing whether he has a chance to succeed, there seems to be no space to inquire about derivative responsibility here. Would his case then be very different from the failure case after all because of this? If this is true, if it is true that his involvement with the consequences of his action is no different from Isabel Archer's, that would be surprising, I think. So to get a more general account of derivative responsibility, we could try this. Responsibility for unforeseen or unforeseeable consequences of one's actions is derivative. Thus, if the rationale for Gauguin's duty to find out about the likely consequences of his success is satisfied in his actual deliberation, then he is responsible and can take credit for his success. If he had failed for reasons internal to the project, he would then have been similarly responsible for the failure. The point to take from Ras is that we need to understand what grounds the duty to inquire further and to overcome ignorance in order to know whether or not the duty was violated. I've already made a somewhat shaky case that Isabel Archer's case. In Isabel Archer's case, the duty wasn't violated. In Gauguin's case, it may be easier to come to the same conclusion. After all, he knows that he doesn't know. As far as leaving his family is concerned, this was the wrong thing to do, and the uncertainty of his decision has no bearing here. As far as becoming a painter is concerned, acting under this kind of uncertainty may be perfectly acceptable. There is no duty to inquire further because there isn't anything that he could have found out by doing so. So, if so, they didn't violate any epistemic duties when entering into their decision. Isabel Archer's failure would then be excused, and Gauguin's unforeseeable success is just a strike of good luck, as if he had bought a lottery ticket and won. This is an odd thing to say in Gauguin's case, and I believe it is false in Isabel Archer's. So here's a way of trying to bring out what's wrong with the derivative responsibility approach. So I first want to make a case why we actually, independently of this view, know that Isabel Archer is responsible, and then run a sort of argument. So quite independently of any questions of derivative responsibility, it seems that Isabel Archer is right to take responsibility for getting herself into the terrible relationship. She couldn't say with a straight face, none of this is my fault, it has nothing to do with me, and so on. Has worked out badly, unfortunately. This kind of response seems all but impossible. But after all, the relationship with Osmond has become her life, and it shapes her thoroughly as a person. She becomes the person she later is as a result of living through the marriage. Or rather, if she had taken the nothing to do with me attitude, she would have lived through the marriage in quite a different way. She would have come to be a different person. But wouldn't that be better? Well, we don't know. All things as things are, it is not all for the worse. She has become more compassionate, more mature, more understanding by suffering through the injustices she experiences. This is shown both in her changing relationship to her cousin, from merely teasing in the beginning to becoming a deep and loving relationship, and in the way she relates to her stepdaughter, for instance. So, if she is to own those changes of her character, the person she's become now, she can hardly disown the decision and actions through which she became that person. After all, the story is is an unfolding of her character. She doesn't become the person she is through some life-changing external event, but through her own choices and by coping with their consequences, as if she were responsible for them. And if she can rightly take responsibility for becoming the caring person who decides to look after her husband's daughter and to overcome menacing threats as she leaves to see her cousin for a last time, she's responsible for taking the action that leads to her becoming this person. In James' story, Isabel Archer, while changing radically, expresses herself clearly and credibly in the way she leads her life. Marrying Osmond is an almost inevitable expression of her younger self, as are the ways in which she continues and changes in coping with the consequences. We admire her throughout and regard both her earlier and later decisions as genuinely hers, as does she herself. So using Williams' expression, her involvement in her actions and their result is never in question. If this is an acknowledgement of her responsibility for her actions at the various stages of her life, then she is responsible, among other things, for deciding to marry Osmond, even though, in a sense, she remarried him in ignorance. In ignorance of quite a few of the relevant facts. If this is so, then we'll get a first premise of an argument. Isabel Archer is responsible for her decision to marry Osmond and its consequences. Now, if the derivative responsibility view is correct, then we get a second premise. If responsibility is negated by ignorance, then her responsibility must be derivative. Therefore, she's derivatively responsible for the consequences of marrying Osmond. However, it remains unclear if she's under a duty to overcome her ignorance, whose rationale would have to be avoiding the consequences of her ignorance. That is, it remains unclear whether Ra's condition is satisfied. According to the current argument, she's derivatively responsible only because she is responsible. But if we can establish responsibility in spite of ignorance, we don't need the principle of derivative responsibility. So perhaps the principle of derivative responsibility isn't valid after all. Perhaps knowledge isn't needed for responsibility. Now, this is hardly and isn't meant to be a conclusive reductio of the principle of derivative responsibility, but I hope it serves to shed some doubt on the view that ignorance negates responsibility. Why then does it seem so often as if ignorance is key? Well, perhaps this is because in some circumstances, for instance in the doctor's case or in cases of professional duties or with regard to legal duties, there are some relatively clear, noble duties concerning what to check and what to secure against, so that there is a way of applying Ra's condition, the condition for determining whether there is a violation of the relevant duty by looking at the rationale for the duty. But the principle of derivative responsibility is a poison chalice anyway, as both Ras and Rosen point out, because in Ra's words, my liability depends not only on wrongful actions, but on wrongful actions for which I'm responsible. So it only pushes the ball one down, basically, even if we can establish a breach of the duty leading to failed action, this doesn't settle the question of responsibility. It is just the beginning, leaving us with a task to account for the basic non-derivative responsibility for the wrongful action. So my final section, saying a little bit more about the idea that I was trying to lay out, that maybe the responsibility here is non-derivative and not negated by ignorance. Ordinary responsibility is not circumscribed in the way I think in which the doctor's responsibility is. And there are a number of differences. First, when we think about responsibility for actions and decisions like Gorgons and Isabel Archer's, the question does not concern liability. There may be an aspect of this in Gauguin's case, but as we've seen, this is quite clear-cut. Leaving his family in the lurch is wrong and not justifiable. As far as responsibility to others is concerned, he shouldn't have undertaken the project he embarked on. But beyond this, the question of whether Gauguin is responsible in a sense that allows him to take credit for his success, to be proud of it, etc., is not negated by the fact that he chose to set on his journey on the basis of scant evidence without knowing what will come of the attempt. In so deciding, he did not violate standards of epistemic due diligence, since there was no way that he could foresee that he will become the great painter he then became. That is, after all, William's point. He knew everything Gauguin did that there was to be known about the likelihood of his success. But what he knew amounts to very little. The problem is not that he failed to get hold of further information, but that the problem is that there was none. Secondly, the claim that our agents are responsible for their decisions and the consequences should not be based on scrutinizing just an individual action, but on the role it played in a person's life. Both Gauguin and Isabel Archer develop into the people they later are because they regard their decisions as rightfully theirs and the consequences theirs to deal with. Therefore, neither Gauguin nor Isabel Archer can disown responsibility for their decision while taking responsibility for their current situation, which is in part a consequence of that decision. They have become a successful painter who is perhaps proud of his achievement and an unhappily married woman who takes charge of her life, in part as the consequence of their earlier decisions and actions. If the decision or the action is not subject to external luck, then the agent is responsible for it. And if it is not subject to external luck, and it is not subject to external luck if it occurs as a matter of exercising one's abilities in the pursuit of a project one has adopted. So William's somewhat unlovely word project covers a lot of ground here, so ambitions, relationships, plans, probably much else. But whatever projects are, they are not single actions, but comprise a whole range of actions and decisions over time. And just to guard against one misunderstanding, saying that Isabel Archer is responsible for her mistakes may sound like she's to blame, but that is not so. Blame is typically third personal. The reason, so she may blame herself, that's a different matter, but think about the third personal variant. The reason why Isabel Archer cannot be blamed for making the bad decision to marry Osmond is that we admire the type of person she is. It would be inconsistent to blame her for the choices she makes when we at the same time admire those choices as perfect expressions of her young self. Her admirability is in part depends on the virtue of being young, if that is a virtue, and in part on not remaining there, learning from the failure and changing in the light of it. Therefore, there is responsibility, but there is no blame. Gauguin is responsible for his success, and he may be praised and admired on the basis of his work. So while blaming a person who expresses an admirable character in her decisions and actions would be while blaming a person who expresses an admirable character in her decisions and actions would be inappropriate, praise of a person who develops and exercises the abilities to produce great art is certainly appropriate. Despite this, he is presumably liable towards his family, owing them compensation. So while there is no cause for blame in the case of Archer, but cause for praise in the case of Gauguin, liability remains in the case of Gauguin. That's at least would be my way of carving through this. And I stop here.
Okay, good. Thank you. Fascinating argument and a phenomenal précis. So I'm going to hand the microphone to people to ask questions. We've got about 25 minutes.
25-minute question? Oh. Ulrike, thanks so much for this. This is wonderfully interesting. So let's agree that what you're trying to get at is not liability and it's not culpability. It's some kind of, it's related to success in some way in a project. I'm just wondering, so the way I tend to think about things, there'll be specific attitudes that are relevant in these different cases. You were mentioning admiration, and that seemed right to me. I feel somewhat differently about the Gauguin case and the Isabel Archer case. So we often talk about admiring somebody as an ex.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm full on with admiring Gauguin as an ex, as a painter. And let's even say his career, his journey as a painter. But I'm not on board with admiring him in a way that, so I'm just wondering whether you think there's a difference between admiring in some aspect and just admiring. With Isabel Archer, yeah, I think I just agree with your judgments. What do you think?
I think exactly that. I mean, in trying to get justification out of the way, this is basically what I wanted to get at, right? There is sort of, if we take it as Williams described it, I didn't look into Gauguin's actual biography, but then it seems he is not altogether an admirable person because the whole journey starts with a grave wrong, right? And that will taint it throughout. So it will remain as an artist. As you described it. In one respect, we admire him, but for that respect, he can also take credit, even though the success was not foreseeable, right? So I think while he can't be proud of his life, he can be proud of his artwork. That remains true, whereas Isabel Archer is different because it's really the unfolding of a character, I think, and that's a different story, yeah.
Suppose Isabel's fate had been linked to someone else, so that the marriage wasn't just bad for her, it was bad for someone else, a child or a friend or something like that. Isabel would presumably have held herself responsible both for what happened to her and for what, as a result of her actions, happened to this other person. Do you think that would have been appropriate? So my reading of the end of the novel is that although Isabel does hold herself responsible, she shouldn't. There's something masochistic about her resolution to remain the person she has made herself when she has an exit and could take it. I've read the ending of that novel. It's devastating.
I know that I reread it for this, and I, for the first time, thought this is the wrong reading, actually, because after all, she comes back to Osmond in the knowledge that he has betrayed her. She will come back a completely different person. So now she can take charge of the marriage and not be the subdued person she was. I think that's where it goes, not by returning to the place she was, but by putting Osmond in his place. I mean, had it been a bit more modern, this may go to divorce, but I think that's the trajectory.
There are two endings. It ends differently in the New York edition. He changed the very end. It really matters which edition you read.
I didn't know that. I see, okay. So there is that, but the earlier question you had is if somebody else had been affected by that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are people affected by that, not terribly, but there's a great disappointment to the cousin and to various other people who are affected. And yeah, I think she should take responsibility for that, right? Because that is a consequence of, again, it's not a consequence she foresaw or could have foreseen, but it's of her making. And so if she kind of makes amends or admits to these people, I was in the wrong, it's probably with that in mind. I know I made you guys unhappy, and it would be strange if she would just brush it under the table, I think.
Yeah, that feels more like agent regret or something along those lines than it does. Well, maybe you think that's a way of taking responsibility for what you've done.
In a way, yes. In a way, yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't do it via regret. I don't like this whole emotion stuff as the guiding feature, but it is of that kind, yes.
Thanks very much, Ulrike. The story of Gauguin, William's story of Gauguin, always perplexes me because Williams himself talks elsewhere about how he's against schematic and underdescribed examples. And the trouble with Gauguin, as Williams tells the story, is that he doesn't really tell the story. We're only given some rather loose details. The actual historical Gauguin was very different from the Gauguin that Williams talks about. Much more complicated, much more detailed, as you'd expect. So there's this difference between Gauguin and Isabel Archer. There's just one Isabel Archer, and she's a fictional character. There are two Gauguins, and one of them's the historical one. Now, there must be reasons why Williams chose to call this fictional character Gauguin, which take us back to the historical character. But there's a real problem there about the example, I think. And if the example is meant to make the point that there are cases where you can take a step outside the morality system and then it can matter, that can be a successful step, and that can be adjudged a successful step in ways which do not depend upon the judgments of the morality system and are completely separate from those judgments, then three comments. First comment, maybe it would have been better for Williams just to make that point and not insist so much on the Gauguin case, because the real Gauguin is complicated and it's not clear what Williams' Gauguin is supposed to be like. It's because it's underdescribed. The second point, if that's the story, that you can take that step outside of the morality system, as Gauguin in Williams' story is supposed to do, then all along we're going to be dealing with two levels of responsibility, right? Because as well as talking about the terms which apply to someone within the morality system, Gauguin until he makes this fateful move to Tahiti, we're talking about people outside that system, which Gauguin becomes when he leaves for Tahiti. So there's arguably two kinds of responsibility, two kinds of assessment that we need to keep in mind here. And third comment, although clearly Williams is not talking about a straight trade-off of value, it's supposed to be two very different kinds of value that we're dealing with. In some sense, they're incommensurable, perhaps. The value of the morality system, the kind of values that are captured by Gauguin if he succeeds in his project. Nonetheless, having said that, I still think it's true that when we think about Gauguin, there's a kind of moral luck in the offing which does depend upon what Williams thinks of as morality system considerations. And it's this: it doesn't just matter for whether we count Gauguin's choice and the subsequent life successful or not. It doesn't just matter for that whether his art is good. It matters too how badly his family do. So surely if Gauguin's family just have a rather rough time, then at the level of the morality system, we're going to think something like, well, that was a bit crappy of Gauguin. If they pine to death because they miss him so much, we're going to judge their loss rather differently. If, on the other hand, they say, well, there are only two problems about Papa. A, he was a bastard, and B, he was never around. So, good riddance to him. Then we'll make a different judgment again. So we're supposed to be taking a step outside the morality system, but there are moral considerations which I think are going to enter into the calculation of luck, which are straightforwardly from the moral.
Right, so that was a lot. Thanks, Sophie. First, the simplification, or the kind of the fictionalization of Gauguin. I mean, at least I feel the pain, even with Isabel Archer, I felt it. You have to make this more toy than it is in in James's novel, right? To actually be able to get out the kind of problem you want to look at. If you look at all the complexity, it just, there's too much going on. And I would imagine that Williams looked at the Gorgons case in a similar way, right? That it can't be done in a way that really does justice to Gauguin as the actual person. And so I find this kind of defensible, actually, to give us an illustration of a possible case and give a name to it while saying this is semi-fictional. And you said there are two kinds of responsibility. I think there are not two kinds of responsibility, but there are two instances for which Gauguin's responsibility has to be considered, I believe. And the one is for leaving his family behind. The other is whether he's responsible for the success he has as an artist. So I wanted to keep those firmly apart as two different questions, saying yes to both, but for different reasons. So in the case of leaving the family behind, this may be fairly straightforward, or it is straightforward if you follow me in getting justification out of the way. And I don't like this idea of stepping outside of the morality system. I think whatever morality is, we are never outside. The thing so it's not as though by setting sail, Gauguin travels to the land of no morality. There is no such land, right? And it's just that there is a moral wrong in his life, and it remains there, and it taints the life. And as I said towards the end, I think claims for compensation, if they could be made by the family, would definitely be valid. But it doesn't follow that once you've done that, once you committed a moral wrong, there is nothing else we can say about your life, about what you do subsequently, right? And so there may be things you do well after you've done this wrong. It's sort of your life. There may be, in this case, you may not think what he does well is something. Yeah, it's not a moral success, at least on William's count, it's clearly not a moral success. He could have had a moral success, right? It could have been that he kind of opened a school for poor people in Tahiti, and we should then probably see that there's good in the men as well, morally speaking. But these are different dimensions of evaluation, it seems to me. And it's not that the one goes away once he leaves, right? I think it is a part of his life that will never go away, having his family left behind. But I think we can still look at the value of his art independently. It's not the same question. That's what I was aiming at. Now, I'm not sure whether I respond. You said a lot more. I'm not sure whether I've responded.
Thanks. I just had a question about one of the reasons you give for thinking that Isabel Archer is responsible for the decision to marry Osmond. And it seemed like one of the things that you were pointing to is that she wants to kind of own the positive character traits, character changes that she undergoes, kind of having made this earlier decision. And I was just wondering how far that might generalize. So there could be lots of situations in which I make kind of decisions one way or another, and they could be really kind of unforeseen or unforeseeable, or whatever kind of weird character changes or other kinds of changes that I might really like that this particular situation or decision that I made brought about. But so you might think that kind of owning those character changes kind of gives me some pressure to take responsibility for the earlier decision. But I'm not sure whether that is a good reason for thinking that we think that she is responsible for the earlier decision, even if kind of she might be right in some sense to kind of find herself accepting the responsibility. And I wondered whether there was kind of distinction between being responsible for some earlier decision in some sense and accepting responsibility where that's like closer to being resigned to the lot in life that the decision got me, which doesn't seem to kind of suggest any kind of real robust sense of responsibility. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I mean, it could be that you get into something, you just stumble in, right? And then at the end you think, oh, it was good that that happened to me. I don't have an example at my fingertips, but there's probably stuff that we could make up where that would be the proper description. So I wanted to tie it down a little bit in saying if what you do actually counts as a proper exercise of your abilities, then you cannot disown it. If it's your agency proper, which brought it on, then you cannot disown it. And in Isabel Archer's case, she does inquire about Osmond. She does test him. She listens to everybody talking to him, right? So she's not just stumbling here. This is a very sort of deliberate, thoughtful way, but the thoughtful way of a young idealistic woman. And that's why it ends up being so flawed. But it is as proper an expression of her agency as anything could have been at the time. And this is why it seems it's not just, the one is if she owns the consequences, perhaps she must own what leads to it. This is one thing I said. The other thing is this, you cannot disown what is so central to who you are actually as an agent and has to be seen as a proper conscientious exercise of your agency. And my third reason was kind of thinking that if we admire her for the decision as much as for the way she takes things forward, we see her as responsible, right? You don't admire somebody for what happens to them, for the accidents in their life. So if it makes sense what I said, that we admire her even in making the wrong decision, because in a way she makes it in a good way, then it seems to me it's not just that she takes responsibility, but we wouldn't say she's responsible, but we do say she's responsible. That's kind of the thought there, roughly.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about Jay Wallace's argument in View from Here. When he says, if I understand correctly, that the results, the situation, the success or failure don't matter because our feelings that we have with regard to them don't matter morally. So he uses this example of Parfit's example of young mother and her daughter, and she says that the fact that the mother affirms the new situation and she has good reasons to affirm it don't matter for the value of her earlier decision. And he considers briefly the idea that, both the daughter and the mother, they have good reasons to affirm the new situation, and that perhaps Gorgon's situation is more like the situation of the daughter, because the daughter, what she affirms first is her own existence, and only the conditions that are secondary. Then he drops it, partly because I think it doesn't make sense when you think about regret. You cannot have a situation in which you cannot help regretting that you exist. But you can have a situation in which you cannot help regretting what you've become. And I was wondering what you think about that.
Right. I only looked at Jay Wallace's work in relation to this justification thing. So do you think it bears straightforwardly on responsibility? What in
Yes, I think it's a question. I think it's a question of owning your decisions and owning the results as something strictly connected with your existence and your decisions, your character.
Yeah, but if it's that, I don't use this "you cannot regret" criterion really, right? This, I hope I don't use it, because that doesn't seem right to me. It gets you these cases, perhaps you cannot regret that you exist, but you're surely not responsible for your own existence. That would get us into very paradoxical territory. So there may be further things of that kind where you cannot regret something, yet that tells us nothing about what you're responsible for. And but with Gauguin, the sort of the aspect of responsibility I'm keen on, the one, is he right to take credit for his work? That's different, right? It's not only that he cannot regret, I think he can regret having come to Tahiti. Perhaps he has some sleepless nights over having gone there. That's fine, but he still can take credit for, or should take credit for his work. So that's I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but that's the sort of responsibility I'm keen on here.
Hi, thanks. So I wonder about the connection between being responsible in the sense you're after and the appropriateness of taking responsibility. So you appeal to the seeming appropriateness of her taking responsibility as a ground for saying that she was responsible, and so you use that kind of move, I think, a few times. So I wonder. Now, you might think that for taking responsibility in many of in some of these cases, there is some kind of freedom. You can decide to take responsibility for certain things, and it would also be appropriate not to take responsibility for those things. And so this kind of existential choice, and it settles who you are in a certain way. But then to think of being responsible as a sort of a fact would then be odd. It would be a choice rather than a fact. But so that on one understanding of what it is to take responsibility. Another understanding, being responsible is the fact that's there, and then if it's there, then you should take responsibility. So maybe you can say a little more about the relation.
Yeah, I know that David Enoch, for instance, has this idea of taking responsibility where through taking it, through some action, you make it so, right? That perhaps you are responsible because you took responsibility for that. I don't believe that, actually, and I think there is a truth of the matter. What's true, of course, in what you just said is that even though the truth of the matter is fuzzy, I have to admit that too. There is a lot of vagueness in there, and if you give me cases, I can't sort them for you. I don't think I have a clear enough grip on what I'm saying myself to do that. But I still think what I'm trying to trace here is something which is actually the case. And so if you don't take responsibility, then you become a different person. That's true, but you would then have become a different person in part by failing to take responsibility for something you should have taken responsibility for, right? So that would be, I think, part of the story. It affects who you are, but it's not optional. I kind of disagree with that. I'm not quite sure whether I have enough to make the case to you that we shouldn't see it as optional, but at any rate, the way I try to set it up was by figuring out what may be the conditions for correctly taking responsibility, right? Rather than thinking this is an action by which you make it the case. And yeah.
There are at least 3 more people wanting to ask questions, but I'm afraid we have to stop there. So let's just thank Ulrike very much indeed.